All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome again to our notes for our test that's coming up. This is Indian Removal Part 1. This is Mr. Rangel. Let's go over these real quick. Indian Removal Part 1. Americans and Indians began to live closer to each other, and when that happens, we started having some problems. Americans began settling Indian lands, and problems began to arise. We have a lot of conflicts, a lot of fights. So Congress decides to fix things, make things better for everybody. What they didn't know is that it was not better for everybody. They passed what's called the Indian Removal Policy, or the Indian Removal Act. And it basically said that we're going to move all the Indians, all these Native Americans, from their land that they've had for generations over on one side of the Mississippi. We're going to move them over to the other side of the Mississippi, over there in the what's called Indian Territory. And the main Indian tribes that were involved were the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Cherokee. And there were others, but these were the main ones. But the one I really want to talk about is the Cherokee. Now, the Cherokee were a little different than the other tribes. The Cherokee, because they'd lived a long time near the American settlers and near the people on the East Coast, they were more what I call Americanized. This is my little definition. Americanized. These were Indians that, first of all, they wore Western clothing. They dressed just like, everybody else. They didn't run around in their war paint and their shirts off and their spears and arrows. No, they were Americanized. They wore Western clothing. They spoke English. They spoke English. They spoke their language too, but they knew English. They had schools, and they even had their own government. So these were Indians who basically were just like Americans, just that they were considered Indians. Well, they were the ones that were forced to move also, but they, instead of just sitting back and letting it happen, they chose to fight against Indian removal policy. They went to court. They took the government to court, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court heard both sides of the case. They heard the Indian side, the Cherokees, and then they heard the side of the American government that wanted to move them. They went back and forth, and finally, Supreme Court come back with a decision that says that Cherokee can stay on their land. So the Cherokee were all happy. They were high-fiving. They were so pleased that the American government, the Supreme Court, that's supposed to be the smartest people, the smartest men in the country, they chose to let them remain on their land. Problem was, there was a but. The president at that time ignored the ruling of the Supreme Court and forced the Cherokee to move. It was something that just totally took the Cherokee tribe by surprise, and they were forced to move. Who was the president? His name was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, again, we talked about him earlier. He was the general at the Battle of New Orleans. That because of his victory at the Battle of New Orleans, he got popular, and his popularity took him to the presidency. And if you remember, the Battle of New Orleans never should have happened because it took place after the peace treaty was signed. So President Jackson becomes president because of a popularity over a battle that never should have happened. And now as president, he's going to make it real hard for the Cherokee tribe. The government creates what's called Indian Territory. It's over where we now call Oklahoma, and it's totally different from where the Indians came from. Now the Indians, they lived in a land that was, they'd been there for generations and generations. They knew where the hunting was the best. They knew where the fishing was the best. They knew when the seasons turned. They knew when to plant their crops, when to harvest their crops. They knew which plants to get their medicine from. They knew the land, but now they're being forced to walk over 600 miles to their new land that they know nothing about. And so on this trip across the country here, there's not enough food, there's not enough medicine, and then they run into cold weather. According to some of the stories, these Cherokee Indians, they were forced to leave their home with whatever they had on them. Only what they had on them. They weren't allowed to take supplies, so whatever they were wearing, they took with them, and they ran into a terrible, terrible snowstorm, and along the way, over 1/4 of the Indians who started on this trip, they died. And the very old and the very young were the first to go, and the rest of them made it, but it was a very, very, very bad trip across to their new land. And forever that journey is called the Trail of Tears. So there you have it. Really quick discussion about the Indian Removal Act, Indian Removal Policy, and the Trail of Tears. Study this for the test. I'm going to ask you about, how many Indians died, the name of this trip, who was the president, the names of the tribes that were forced to move, and study that, and I know you'll get a good grade on the test coming up real soon. All right, so this is Mr. Angel. I'll talk to you in class. Talk to you later. Bye bye.